In the summer of 1984, in a city outside Stockholm, Sweden, suspicious-looking trash bags were found discarded on the streets. The police were horrified and repulsed by what lay inside. The investigation into her death would lead the police to two peculiar suspects and unfold into one of the most controversial and debated cases in the history of Swedish law. Who was this victim whose body had been desecrated and thrown out like garbage? And who was the monster, or possibly monsters, who had taken her young life? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. On July 18, 1984, several black plastic bags were discovered on an urban motorway that ran between Solna and Västberga, which ran along the western part of Stockholm's inner city, an area that was notorious for prostitution and drug use. When officers were called to the scene to investigate, they were shocked and disgusted to find that they contained the dismembered remains of what was believed to be a female. Then on August 7th, a second set of bags was located nearby. The woman's head was missing. Senior staff member Jovan Rice of the forensics department at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm performed the autopsy. The examination concluded that the most probable cause of death was homicide. The examination performed on the victim revealed that one of her breasts had been removed. Her internal organs were missing, and her genitalia had been cut off. The woman's body had been mutilated and butchered into pieces. If it weren't for her hands being intact inside one of the bags, it would have been impossible to confirm the identity of the victim. She was later identified as 28-year-old Katrine da Costa. She had been reported missing by her mother more than a month earlier. Katrine da Costa was the epitome of a marginalized victim. Born Katrine Backstrom in Luleå, Sweden, in 1956. Not much is known of her childhood, but the young woman got messed up with the wrong crowd and found herself addicted to heroin while she was still in high school. Katrine left home shortly after and lived on the streets, selling her body to support her drug habit. She was married for a short while and had a child with a man in Portugal, where she also lived. But nothing could stop the darkness from entering back in, and she found herself once again using heroin and on the streets. She lost custody of her two children along the way to social services and was homeless. Katrine worked the streets to survive. During the spring of 1984, she had lived at different men's houses and at other times was sleeping in shelters. The last known sighting of Katrine being alive was in Kungsträd Garden, one of the oldest preserved parks in Stockholm. It was the weekend of Whitsunday, also known as Pentecost, which is a Christian holiday that falls on the seventh Sunday after Easter. It commemorates the coming of the Holy Ghost upon the disciples of Christ. It is a nationally recognized day in Sweden, where most businesses are closed and families celebrate, feasting and spending time together. Homicide investigators received many tips and leads, some of which they pursued and others they ignored. But nothing solid or significant panned out. That is until the fall of 1984, when everything changed. Law enforcement was contacted by a man who identified himself as the former father-in-law of a coroner. He claimed that his ex-son-in-law frequently picked up prostitutes. The man's name was Tiit Harm. Tiit Harm was a young doctor who worked at the Department of Forensic Medicine at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. He left a trail of ominous circumstances in the wake of Katrine da Costa's death that had not gone unnoticed. His wife had died 2 years earlier in 1982 under bizarre and to some what were considered to be suspicious circumstances. Her body was found hanging on the side of their bed. She was dressed in fancy party attire. Although the police and family members found it highly suspicious, and some thought she may have been a victim of foul play, the doctor was never charged. His young wife's untimely death, who he had already arranged a divorce and was seriously involved with another woman at the time, was deemed to be a suicide. The young doctor's reaction to his soon-to-be ex-wife's terrible death didn't sit well with some of the officers. The man was cold, showing no emotion, and a strange, very calloused, and insensitive move. He wrote and published an academic paper on death by hanging, or specifically strangulation, not too long after her death. His wife's family didn't believe for 1 second that she had taken her own life, and they began to spread rumors that the young doctor had killed her. In fact, his mother-in-law utilized her position as an employee of the Swedish tabloid Expressen to perpetuate sinister beliefs around him. It was difficult to deny that Tiit Harm was a strange, even possibly disturbed man. He was highly intelligent and extremely invested in his work as a coroner. Not only was he known for enthusiastically inviting others to watch him perform autopsies, but he was also known to send autopsy reports along with very graphic pictures to people who were not involved in the investigation at all, much less who had requested them. The doctor also had an unusually high interest in horror and sex, with horror films that included sexual violence being a preferred watching experience for him. It was also common knowledge that he was sexually liberated, as was his previous wife, and he had multiple encounters with prostitutes. The Department of Forensic Medicine had been aware of his plans to divorce his wife and set up house with a new woman, in addition to his affinity for sexual liaisons with prostitutes, none of which they were pleased with. These were all, of course, personal matters that were not necessarily illegal, but the department found his behavior embarrassing, especially since he often worked closely alongside the police. It could have been grounds for the doctor's dismissal, or at a minimum, his rejection of a new employment contract. Another unsettling factor that possibly linked the young doctor to Katrine DaCosta was how pieces of her body were discovered very close to the Department of Forensics Medicine. In December 1984, the forensic pathologist was arrested for suspicion of murder in both Katrine DaCosta's death and his wife's 2 years earlier. Officers held him in custody for the maximum number of 5 days, as permitted by the law. The police performed a thorough search of his residence, but there was no evidence connecting him to Katrine DaCosta's murder or having known the young woman at all. However, at least according to some sources, there was ample evidence of possible S&M and interest in violent sex and torture, including hardcore pornography, a whip, a knife, and a doll with a wire around its neck. But this wasn't evidence of any crime, much less his involvement in the murder and dismemberment of the woman. Further, there was no communication between the two, nor had he ever written her a prescription for drugs. This was pertinent to note because Katrine DaCosta had received prescriptions from multiple doctors. 5 days later, with only admissions of his having a few liaisons with prostitutes in the Stockholm area, and absolute denial of killing his wife or Katrine, whom the doctor swore he had never met, T-Tarm was released. The media, in particular the tabloids, plastered the young doctor's face and name across the headlines. It was observed how law enforcement had done nothing to protect his identity from being released to the press, which, considering he hadn't been charged, was perceived by some to be unfair and biased. Some believed the police had intentionally released it so he would lose his position at the forensics department. The Board of Social Welfare, which oversaw the forensics medicine department, making them his employer, fired him based on these mere suspicions alone of his committing murder. The police were pleased with themselves. They had issues with his encounters with prostitutes, and they wanted him to pay for his immoral sexual behavior. When he was fired, the suspicion and rumors followed him, and he faced great difficulty in securing another position in the field. T-Tarm's work meant everything to him, and without it, the young doctor felt lost, hopeless, and of very little value. T-Tarm eventually attempted suicide. Due to the life-saving treatment he received, he ended up losing most of his hearing. By the summer of 1986, the police had closed the case against him, and with no evidence or any new clues regarding an alternative suspect, the murder case grew cold. But the investigators continued to harbor suspicion, even resentment, toward the pathologist. In the early 1980s, 1982 to be precise, T-Tarm had a student named Thomas Algen, with whom he had developed a good relationship. At one point, he even helped the young man fulfill his school requirements after Thomas missed a scheduled autopsy. To express his gratitude, he and his wife invited the pathologist and the new woman in his life to have dinner at their home. The woman showed up dressed in very sexy, inappropriate clothes, which really upset and angered Thomas's wife. And she never met with the couple in a social setting again. There was something about the coroner, this young pathologist, the wife didn't like at all, and she grew to hold a deep disdain for the man. At this same time, the wife had growing suspicions that her young daughter had been sexually abused by her husband. Allegedly, some physical signs the child had may have been perceived as such to an everyday person. However, doctors, after multiple examinations of the young girl, didn't think there were any grounds, much less proof of these horrible accusations the wife continued to make. It didn't seem to matter to the wife, though, and the woman refused to believe it wasn't true. The couple later ended up getting divorced. In 1984, when the wife of the now general practitioner, Thomas Algen, read that a forensic doctor, a coroner, had been a suspect in the murder, she contacted the police. When the woman inquired whether it had been the doctor who had come over for dinner years earlier to her house, the police, ignoring basic legal and professional protocol, confirmed that it was. Fast forward 2.5 years after Katrine DaCosta's remains were found, and some strange and unexpected developments surfaced in the case. This woman's child began to tell her weird and disturbing random things. The child spoke about a doll without a head. These words planted a seed of suspicion in the mother that maybe her ex-husband had been an accomplice to the coroner, and together they had killed and dismembered the young woman. She convinced herself that her child had been witness to these horrific events. So the now ex-wife of Thomas Algen incessantly questioned her young daughter, who was only about 4 years old and had been about 1.5 years old at the time of these alleged events. She began to ask her about her father and the teacher at the forensics department and what they had done to her and to the woman, Katrine. The mother wrote down notes and even recorded these conversations with her 4-year-old daughter, believing them to be incriminating statements of evidence. The woman went to the police with her suspicions about her husband and the coroner sexually abusing her daughter, and submitted 200 pages of what she deemed as proof of their involvement. That wasn't where it stopped, though. This paranoid and obsessed mother frequently called officers to inform them of anything new her child had said, which to her was further evidence of their guilt. Now, 2 mental health experts, a psychiatrist, Frank Lindblad, and a psychologist, Margareta Eriksson, would assess this so-called evidence, including determining the credibility of both the mother and child. Experts in child psychology and forensic psychiatry, by applying what is known as the psychodynamic approach, they both concluded that the mother's statements were credible and that the small child had been at the scene of the crime. This was primarily determined based on the child's visit to the Department of Forensic Medicine, where it was believed to be the site of the murder and dismemberment. It was recorded how the child showed no emotion at all while she was there. This was used as evidence that the trauma she suffered was buried so deeply underneath due to the violence she was exposed to that she couldn't show any emotion at all. The psychodynamic approach held a lot of weight and credibility among many medical and forensic professionals and was further supported by professors. The support this approach has from so-called professionals and experts led to very few people, including the media, questioning this method. Once this child's story became sensationalized headline news, other residents in the area began to come forward, recalling seeing who appeared to be the men, maybe even both of them together. One particular witness, walking her dog, informed the police that she had seen what could have been the 2 doctors, along with a small child, enter the anatomical department on that weekend. The child's story, as relayed by her mother, mentioned a photographer at the crime scene. This led people to believe that photos of the dismemberment of Katrine DaCosta's body must exist. In late 1987, towards the end of the investigation, the police received a call from a couple who owned a photography shop located near the forensics department. They said that years earlier, during the summer of 1984, they had developed a roll of film that horrified them. There were images of dismembered body parts and images of an unidentified person wearing blood-spattered clothing. The couple, along with their staff, were very disturbed and upset when they viewed these images, but they handed them over to the client. The person claimed that the images were part of a secret investigation and that no one must be aware of their existence. When the Photoshop owners were given a police lineup that included the 2 suspected doctors, they identified the younger man, the general practitioner, as being one of the clients, and sort of recognized the coroner. However, investigators' tapes revealed that the wife was the only one who identified the general practitioner, and it was only after being guided by the officer's reactions. The woman initially identified a different person altogether, and her husband identified one of the police officers that was included in the lineup. Both identified Thomas Algen as being the customer, but again, this was only after much hesitation and an affirming reaction from the officer. Police lineups are notoriously unreliable. People can become confused about whether they saw that particular individual at the time of the incident, or if they just remember seeing their photograph somewhere from another source, especially the media. The correct protocol is to show one image of a suspect at a time and not in a photo array. Unfortunately, police departments often don't follow this protocol. This can lead to innocent persons being identified as the culprit. I have been exposed to this strange police tactic of identifying a perp, and it can be very confusing. I was exposed to a police lineup, specifically a photo array, which is a photo spread of multiple individuals who all look alarmingly similar. Even as the primary victim in a crime, it is very difficult not to doubt or question your memory. Of course, you don't want there to be only one suspect that is extremely different from the others because this causes confirmation bias. However, the majority of people are overly confident in their visual memories, which both time and trauma have shown adversely affect. And this overconfidence in their memories spills over into the juries, which overwhelmingly trust and have a great amount of misplaced faith in eyewitness testimony. Wrongful convictions based on eyewitness testimony far outweigh any other sources or reasons, such as forced false confessions or junk science. It is the number one culprit that leads innocent people to a life of incarceration and sometimes even to death row. What was also interesting to point out that during the investigation, the police learned that it wasn't that uncommon for photos to be taken of an autopsy illegally. Considering the Photoshop was so close to the forensic department, it wasn't illogical to think that the Photoshop owners had seen other images of autopsies and equated them to the dismemberment of Catherine DaCosta. I can only imagine that autopsy photos would be shocking, grotesque, and traumatizing for an everyday person to come across. Apparently, neither the Photoshop owners nor any of the other Photoshops in the area were ever asked if they had come across similar photographs, or if this was a one-time thing. In October of 1987, forensic pathologist Teet Harm and general practitioner Thomas Algen were arrested and charged with murder and child abuse. The investigation would uncover that not only did both of the men accused deny murdering or dismembering Catherine DaCosta, but neither of them had seen one another since 1982. It wasn't until October of 1987 when they met again while in custody for what police called a confrontational interrogation. This was organized by officers with the hope that the men would disclose incriminating information to one another, but neither of them ever did. In fact, both seemed completely clueless and genuinely concerned as to why police believed they were guilty of these atrocious crimes. Never once did they convey anything that implicated their guilt or involvement in any way. On January 22, 1988, the coroner and the general practitioner would face charges of homicide and the sexual abuse of a child in court. The atmosphere resembled a lynch mob instead of a courtroom. There were angry, hostile residents protesting feminists and a massive media presence that were solely bent on portraying these two defendants as sadistic, female-hating killers. The prosecution presented their key witness, the ex-wife of the general practitioner, Thomas Algen, who provided testimony as communicated by their daughter. Mind you, the child was under 2 years old at the time of these alleged events. Her testimony was backed up by the professional examination that was conducted by the aforementioned mental health experts, child psychiatrist Frank Lindblad and psychologist Margareta Eriksson. The courtroom listened with bated breath as this mother shared the most horrific and shocking details of the grisly dismemberment as told to her by her small child. The faces of the jury members went white. They were appalled, disgusted, and revolted by the disturbing words that were said by a child. According to the child's story, the lady, meaning Katrine, had a diary that shared the wild sexual acts between her and the doctors and acts between them all while the toddler was there. It was told by the child that Katrine had been a quasi-babysitter to the girl. According to her mother, as communicated in the courtroom, the child said the following statements. In the beginning she was whole, but then she was torn into pieces. When she had no head, she could not talk. They drilled and drilled. They drilled off their heads. They threw it into the wastepaper basket. Then she became pulp. The mother testified to the court and the jury that her daughter told her about these ritual murders, cannibalism, including the ingestion of the eyes, homosexual intercourse that happened between her father and the coroner, and witnessing the two men grilling heads. Amazingly, these grotesque, shocking details were never challenged in court or questioned as fact or fiction in the media. For some reason, everyone just bought this child's stories, documented by a mother who blatantly hated both defendants and whose credibility was backed up by child health care professionals. What is particularly strange about these professionals' assessments of the mother and child being taken at face value is how the child was never interviewed by the police department's own legal experts. The mother's statements were hearsay in the purest form. She had questioned her child, guiding and directing her daughter to make incriminating statements against her father and the coroner, whom the mother had open resentment and bias toward. This woman was not an expert or professional of any kind, and she would record statements summarizing what her child revealed to her. The following is one of the mother's statements. I have drawn conclusions of what she has said, and I have woven pictures of what can have happened. And I have sometimes, so to say, been half a step ahead of her and sort of understood what she was aiming at now and then. And she has eventually arrived there herself. Critical analysis later done on the case revealed that when it comes to a mother recalling what their children say to them, their memories were not only inaccurate, but what a child says versus what they mean to say can be impossible to distinguish. First of all, the little girl was 17 months old and only a few years older when she began talking about all of these horrific, unbelievable events. How could anyone believe these stories? Not only were they obscene, outlandish, and grotesque, but a child wouldn't understand what any of those things meant, much less communicate witnessing such events. They wouldn't have the words or the intelligence to form such thoughts. This is just one of the reasons why most child witnesses are considered invalid. Why is it that almost everyone believed these asinine statements claimed to be made by a child? Secondly, why was it not clearly obvious that the mother had coached her to recall in explicit detail what her father and the coroner had done in front of her? Thirdly, she never said any of these things to the psychiatrist or the psychologist, nor the police officers. She never once implicated that her father sexually abused her, much less killed and cut up Katrine DaCosta. They all simply chose to listen to this angry mother's paranoid, insane claims and ignore the fact that the child had never said anything regarding these issues or events to anyone other than her. It would be too easy to label the jury members as both uneducated and gullible. But even that would be too simple, because it was also the police, the courts, the media, and the community at large who bought into this absurd nonsense, as if they were legal fact. The media, in large part at the vengeful direction of the coroner's former mother-in-law, who, as aforementioned, was an employee at the Swedish tabloid Expressen, spread hatred and undue bias against the two doctors every chance they got. The case of a child's horrendous stories that pointed blame at two young medical professionals became prime material for the press, and they were more than happy to mislead the public about the evidence in exchange for selling papers. The media wrote about the defendants and their crimes as if they were truth. The child's stories were beyond horrific and graphic. They included detailed acts of ritual abuse, cannibalism, and sex with a prostitute, as well as between the two accused, all of which a child who was only 17 months old at the time had allegedly witnessed. That it was two doctors, members of a field which was considered the elite of Sweden, made the tales even more sensational, and society couldn't get enough. The media didn't hold much respect or value toward the police or the prosecutor, nor did they offer any semblance of privacy or respect shown toward the accused. Whether the media was uneducated or they simply didn't care, they spread that the child's stories were collected by expert child psychologists and psychiatrists, which the public believed to be true, when in fact the only individual who had ever heard these child stories was her mother. A leading psychologist, Holgersson, asserted that the child's stories, as conveyed by the mother, were not at all credible. This resulted in a vicious backlash against the doctor. The Union of Psychologists formally denounced his contribution as a witness psychologist after these statements were made that refuted the child's stories. No one seemed to even entertain the possibility that the child's stories were made up by the mother. Next came the testimony given by one of the defendant's mentors, Jovan Rice, who had performed the autopsy on Katrine DaCosta. Dr. Rice, during the criminal trial, testified as to how the exact cause of death couldn't be determined based on the absence of physical evidence, in particular her internal organs and her head. However, Dr. Rice strongly believed that based on the way the body was cut up, the methods indicated that the individual or individuals were skilled and experienced at human dismemberment. These details within the autopsy report implicated and supported the theory that Tiet Harm was one of the primary perpetrators in the murder and dismemberment. When the prosecution asked Dr. Rice if the dismemberment of a body is rarely not preceded by the act of murder, the doctor concurred this to be true. However, although the cutting up of a corpse is not evidence of homicide, however, some believe it is, since otherwise, what would be the purpose of performing such a task, if not to conceal the crime of killing? Nevertheless, dismemberment and the concealment of a body does not equate to intentional homicide in the eyes of the law. It was later criticized that the coroner in particular seemed to be persecuted and was tried for his character and not on any evidence of his literal guilt. The prosecution presented him as a disturbed, sadistic man who frequently had sex with prostitutes, loved violent horror films, and was highly invested in his work as a post-mortem dissector. They presented this information as if it equated to his being guilty of murder. Teet Harm's interests and characteristics were not necessarily unique, but together, especially for the time, established the personality, the character of a man who could be capable of committing murder and dismemberment. Interestingly, the prosecutor never asked the multiple prostitutes who allegedly knew the coroner as a client, specifically a client of the deceased, to testify. Some of these women claimed to have even seen the defendant with her. In response, the prosecutor stated that since they were prostitutes, they were unreliable witnesses. He didn't want any of them on the stand, as their credibility as witnesses would have inarguably been challenged by the defense. Yes, this stance is judgmental and wrong, but in matters of the law, the credibility of a witness is critical to establishing their testimony with the jury. Although this was highly criticized, it is not at all surprising that the prosecutor chose to exclude these women's testimony, regardless of how significant it may have been. However, many people believed that how the prosecution dismissed them and how the trial was overall conducted was a dark reflection of the societal extent of violent male oppression over females. When it came to the defense counsel, they didn't have much to present or even challenge. In the Swedish justice system, defense attorneys are known for being inadequate and ineffective, especially when it comes to questioning expert testimony of witnesses, such as psychologists and psychiatrists. It was noted how in this particular case, an employee of one of the defense counsel believed the defendants to be guilty and even publicly stated so. The accused men couldn't even rely on their own attorneys to believe in them enough to question the credibility of the child's stories or the testimony of these experts. So why would anyone else? Before the jury could read their verdict, the defendants were transferred to have a forensic psychiatric examination conducted. Meanwhile, a few of the jurors had previously agreed to do interviews with the media. They expressed confusion and hesitation around the guilt of the defendants because the evidence was inarguably weak, but they were willing and ready to convict them for murder because the men were perverse and most likely guilty. Needless to say, their actions were completely unethical and illegal. It was set within jury rules and restrictions to refrain from talking to anyone, especially the media, about the trial while it was still going on. In addition to these actions, the chairperson of the court missed a critical meeting. On March 9, 1988, these two events led to a mistrial. Chief Prosecutor Halen knew he was facing a losing battle and was ready to dismiss the case. However, an article written in Dagens Nyheter, Sweden's leading daily newspaper at the time, by psychotherapist Hanna Olsen, had ignited outrage and protests. She claimed that both men were guilty, but they were being protected by a male oppressive society built around privilege and class, and the continued acceptance of the sexual exploitation and violence of females, in particular, through acts of prostitution. Dr. Olson addressed how the victims' fellow prostitutes who wanted to testify against the defendants were oppressed because they were perceived as being worthless, unreliable, and the very bottom of society. It would be impossible to deny that if the victim had been of an upper class and had not been a struggling, drug-addicted, homeless prostitute, the legal system would have fought much harder for justice. And it didn't sit well with much of Sweden that the accused killers were both of an elite class. But this was only the beginning of the doctor's persecution. Even though their trial had ended in a mistrial, society, the media, and fellow forensics members, as well as the legal system, wanted these men to pay. Many believed they were guilty and, in the very least, should not be permitted to practice medicine ever again. Initially, the Trade Union of Medical Doctors, which hold high value and influence in Sweden, came to the men's defense and supported their right to continue treating patients. However, there was a major divide amongst the members of the union, in particular from a large group of female doctors who felt the crime and the trial had been anti-female. The Health and Medical Services Responsibility Board reviewed this information within the judgment and decided to take action against the doctors. On May 23, 1989, they would give in to the outrage of many citizens and revoke the men's rights to practice medicine. Both defendants immediately appealed, but in 1990, the men would face their destinies in criminal court once again. The appeals court, in a rare and shocking move, instructed the district court judge that a murder conviction was not likely to be upheld. Entering the second trial, the atmosphere had now transformed itself into a political circus. The prosecution faced mounting pressure from Folkaktionen mot pornografi, which is also known as the People's Campaign Against Pornography, and at least 70 feminist women's organizations. They had written to the prosecutor demanding that the two graphically violent sex films owned by Teed Harm to be shown in the courtroom. Speaking of prejudicial bias, but they were shown during their trial. During the trial, many of the same witnesses from the first trial testified against the defendants. But this time, there was a prostitute who allegedly had the diary of the victim, Katrine DaCosta. She read detailed excerpts from the diary that mirrored the child's stories. However, it was believed to be a forgery. The woman had been interviewed by Sveriges Television, in which she described how the victim, Katrine DaCosta, had been subjected to violent sex games in the presence of a small child. Yet when the police interviewed the same woman, she had given them a completely different story. The Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare was given the task of determining the victim's official cause of death by performing a new autopsy on Katrine DaCosta. Since the victim had been decapitated and her internal organs were missing, there was no way to ascertain the way she had been killed. This led to the defendants being acquitted of her murder. The two men were also acquitted on the count of sexual abuse of a child. However, the court did believe that the men were guilty of cutting up the body beyond a reasonable doubt. Within the reasons of the verdict, the court stated that the doctors had dismembered her corpse at the forensics department during the Whitsun weekend. This legal statement also specified that the general practitioner's daughter was present during these events. However, since the doctors were never charged on account of dismemberment of a body, and the possibility of this charge had since expired, they couldn't be held criminally liable. Now, claiming that the doctors were responsible for cutting up the victim, it wasn't much of a leap to assume that one, if not both of them, had been responsible for Katrine DaCosta's death. But they had to be acquitted on the charges based on lack of evidence. Not only did this alleged evidence, in particular the child's story, not meet the legal requirements of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but there wasn't even enough to support reasonable suspicion, also known as the minimum requirement for an arrest. The Svea Court of Appeal later declared that the trials contained procedural errors and a conflict of interest. The court declared that both defendants be released from custody, given the weak evidence against them. It was considered to be hypocritical and ironic how the Court of Appeals played a critical role in depriving the suspects of any right to appeal. Even though the men had been formally acquitted, their verdict was structured under the law so that they remained guilty but were also ineligible for an appeal. This was because reasons within the judgment didn't hold any legal effect and therefore can't be appealed. The prosecutor was the only person with the authority to appeal their sentences, but, as he stated, he found it meaningless to do so because the Court of Appeals had already given its opinion on the matter. The doctors continued to fight, losing their medical licenses, but without any success. The Supreme Administrative Court felt pressured by the public to uphold the revocation of the men's medical licenses, and in 1991, it directed the Administrative Court of Appeals to do the same. This was at a time in Swedish history when the feminist movements and awareness of sexual abuse against women and children began to take root in society. The sexual liberalism of the decades before was something of the past, and feminist groups and other groups against female violence and child abuse, in particular incest, were outraged, and they were fed up with the lack of concern and accountability. This anti-incest movement rose during a transition period in Sweden when women were no longer encouraged to be homemakers and instead to participate in the workforce. It was looked down upon by society for females to stay at home with the kids. Meanwhile, a high level of trust and social investment in psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers was granted. This established a newfound sense of expertise in how parents raised their children. In other words, parenthood became a concept and a reality that could and should be taught and directed by these so-called child experts. This led to an overdependence on daycare centers with specially trained staff, whom most of society believed were better equipped and skilled with kids than their own parents. The Swedish government ultimately bought into the experts' beliefs. Their methods and behaviors were not to be doubted, as they were based on respected, proven social science. Of course, this wasn't the reality. With this new respect and trust in these child experts came new powers of influence and control over the lives of children, particularly in the courts and in matters of social welfare. As a result, and a tragic outcome, thousands of children in Sweden and across Scandinavia were taken away from their families and placed in the foster care system. Along with the increase in daycare and over-reliance on childcare experts came the belief that a large number of children, but especially young girls, were at a high risk of being sexually abused. Influenced by the satanic panic and ritual cult abuse events occurring in the United States at the time, similar accusations and rumors began to spread in Scandinavia. Cases of alleged child abuse and neglect, whether proven to be false or not, led many children to be ripped away from their parents and placed in the system. This ultimately gave psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers more authority than the law, similar to the foster care system and the tragic outcome we have seen time and time again in the United States. The authorities rarely looked in on children once they were placed in a home, and when complaints or allegations of neglect or abuse would arise, they were never found to be credible, if ever investigated at all. What has been coined Kindergulag, as written in a 1983 article about the Swedish welfare state, grew into a crisis, with the state overextending its authority and taking children away from their parents, often on a weak, unfounded basis. The reason this is important and relevant to this case is that it strongly impacted how the expert testimony of the child psychologist and psychiatrist were viewed. As a result, it heavily influenced the jury's perception and thus their decision made in the trials. Their expert opinions were considered to be almost untouchable, and that they weren't challenged or questioned. What is particularly bizarre is how these child experts bought the mother's statements without any question of her credibility, especially considering the amount of research that shows how unreliable children are as witnesses. For the most part, children are not perceived to be reliable, valid witnesses because they don't understand what they see versus what they have been told what they saw. Their memories are frequently guided by either their parents, a child health expert, or another adult with authority, such as a police officer. That a toddler's stories were believed to be fact was not only ridiculous because she was way too young to remember, but the line between reality and fantasy, or rather imagination, is often too blurry for them to distinguish. In the case of the dismemberment trials, this child had been guided to remember and recall stories as specifically told by her mother over several years, which then became false memories. Only the mother knows whether she herself truly believed these events ever happened. However, it can't be argued that she held a vicious grudge for both defendants, which should have been acknowledged in court by their defense counsel as a potential strong motive for manipulation and thus deceit. It was learned later on that allegedly the mother had visited Professor Eva Lundgren and spoke with her about wanting a divorce. When she inquired with the professor as to how best to deal with custody of their daughter, they then discussed how the matter could be resolved if she accused her husband of incest. If this is true, then it proves that she was motivated to concoct this horrific story about child abuse, knowing it would likely prevent her husband from having custody or any parental rights. Then along the way, she either became delusional and convinced herself that her ex-husband was involved in the murder and dismemberment, or she had become so bitter and vengeful over time that she wanted her former husband, Thomas Algen, to pay for the rest of his life. Over the next decade, there was continued division and debate over this case, with different books and reports analyzing and critiquing the trial and the subjects. In a 700-page book, Death is a Man, written by author Per Lindberg, possible new clues were even introduced. He claimed that Katrine da Costa was known by reliable witnesses to have been alive after the date she was allegedly murdered. A man had claimed he spoke with Katrine on 2 separate occasions after his birthday, which was on June 10th. This would have been after the Whitsun weekend. It was recorded that the child had been with her father, Thomas Algen, for several hours alone on June 9th, 1984, the day the prosecution stated Katrine DaCosta had been murdered. It was also observed that the victim had injected narcotics on the Sunday before her alleged murder occurred, and yet no drugs were found in her autopsy that confirmed the stated day of her death. Allegedly, this testimony was ignored or forgotten about because the police and the prosecution were faced with an extremely high amount of pressure ever since Prime Minister Olof Palme had been killed in 1986, and that case remained unsolved. It was also learned that an error was made in the filing of one of the testimonies regarding Katrine DaCosta's whereabouts, which led to its exclusion. Slowly, many people in society began to believe that the former doctors may in fact have been innocent. In 3 separate articles in June 1999, a reporter claimed that the police were convinced that the doctors were innocent of the crime and were working diligently to locate a new suspect. In 1999, the 2 defendants filed an appeal with the Supreme Administrative Court with the hope of having their cases reopened. In 2001, their hopes were destroyed when it was determined that the new evidence about another possible perpetrator wasn't strong enough, and any technical legal arguments were rejected since an acquittal can't be appealed. The European Court later denied their admission to appeal their cases. Journalist Lars Borgnes published Sanningen är en sällsynt gast, translated into Truth is a Rare Guest, which posited that Katrine DaCosta was murdered by a serial killer. In 2003, new technology was employed to locate traces of fingerprints that had been found on the bags that contained her dismembered corpse. Criminal analysts found fingerprints, but they didn't match either the general practitioner or the coroner's. A new appeal to reopen the case was filed. After this discovery, surprisingly, the police decided to reopen the homicide case. For a few days, another suspect was held in custody and arrested for murder, but soon he was released, and the case returned to being cold. In 2005, a DNA analysis was performed on a towel that was found within one of the plastic bags. There were hairs discovered on the towel. When they were tested and examined, it was determined with 100% analytical certainty that the hairs didn't belong to either Tiet Harm or Thomas Algen. That same year, Tiet Harm and Thomas Algen sued for 40 million kroner, which equates to around 4.1 million in US dollars, on the grounds of lost wages and character defamation. The Chancellor of Justice, who handled questions of voluntary damages, ruled that the courts should determine such a large financial claim. In 2007, the men's attorney registered a claim for 35 million kroner with the Atunda lower court. In November 2009, the trial against the Swedish state began. In February 2010, the district court agreed that multiple errors had been committed in the men's trials, but it didn't warrant the state being liable for the damages. Earlier in June 2009, Katrine DaCosta's murder case was officially shut due to the crime having a 25-year maximum statute. Ironically and tragically, Sweden changed this law in July 2010 and abolished the statute on murder, genocide, and crimes against humanity. although the legislation was retroactive, meaning that it could be applied to cold cases older than 25 years. It didn't apply to Katrine DaCosta's case, since it had already been statute barred. The expiration of the prosecution of a crime, also known as the statute of limitations, is a very interesting and controversial topic in criminal law. Imagine how many murderers, especially cold case serial killers, such as the Golden State Killer, would walk free if there was a statute of limitations on homicide. However, what about all the other violent crimes? Should the ability to prosecute them expire? Specifically in the case of rape or sexual assault, the statute of limitations in the United States, for example, varies from state to state. Many states no longer have an expiration date on such crimes, but in some states, for example, like Florida, it's only 3 to 4 years. Fortunately, in most cases of child sexual abuse or child rape, there are no statute of limitations. In many other states, it all depends on the evidence. In particular, if DNA was collected and a match is found, then there is no time limit on criminal prosecution. In Sweden, the time limit for such a crime is currently 10 years, although there has been legislation pushing for any crimes committed against children to be excluded from this. What many people failed to realize at the time of their criminal trials was that Teet Harm and Thomas Algen were not the only strong possible suspects in Katrine DaCosta's murder. Instead of taking these alternate suspects seriously, the police chose to ignore these men and focus on making the evidence fit the narrative that the coroner and the general practitioner had committed the crime. One day after Katrine DaCosta's dismembered remains were located, the police were given a tip to look into a man named Stanislav Ganerka, a previously convicted serial killer who had no alibi when she was killed. The tip was submitted by a most reputable source, former detective Thomas Gottling. He told officers that Ganerka now lived in his police district in Södertälje. It was known that the man frequently bought meat cuts at different stores in Stockholm. He dismembered the animal cuts inside his apartment, which he then sold to some of his acquaintances. Ganerka, a Polish butcher who was also once a police officer, moved to Sweden. He became known as Slaktaren, the butcher, who murdered at least 3 individuals. It was even acknowledged during police interviews and visits to a butcher shop with Dr. Jovan Rice that the dismemberment could have been performed by someone with expertise in cutting up animals. This statement was later revised when he said that it was likely someone who had skills in dismembering human carcasses instead. In 1974, Ganerka had killed and dismembered his first known victim, Wanda Verdosh. Children playing near a dumpster found 2 human thighs wrapped in plastic. The same claim had been made by another kid the day before, but their parents didn't believe them. This time, though, some of the parents found the story suspicious and decided to contact the local police. It was recorded that the package containing the thighs was bloody, but the container was clean. The body parts themselves were dismembered as if done by someone with skills. The limbs had been removed from the body by severing the legs and torso at the knee joints up to the femoral neck. Like in Katrine DaCosta's case, the woman's head was also never found. Stanislav Ganerka was convicted of aggravated assault and negligent homicide and was sent to a forensic psychiatric hospital for treatment. Less than 2 years later, he was permitted leave to visit some relatives in Poland. While he was there, he was arrested for petty crimes and sent back to Sweden, where he had recently gained citizenship. While Ganerka was in Ystad, he murdered Ruth Norinder and Arthur Anderson. Again, the courts remanded him for psychiatric treatment. And shockingly, after brutally slaying and dismembering 3 people, he was released in 1983. This wasn't the only time that the police ignored tips they received regarding Ganerka as a suspect in Katrina Costa's murder. 2 prostitutes on Momschilnetsgaten, where Katrina Costa had been walking, identified a man that matched Ganerka's description. Another man contacted the police to report that he had dropped Ganerka off near this area, but the officer didn't even write down his contact information. It was confirmed by multiple prostitutes in the area that a man fitting his description frequently visited them there. Another report was made to the police from a person allegedly close with the suspect who claimed that something terrible has happened inside his home. Amazingly, the police never looked into the situation. Without any alibi, not to mention his previously committed eerily similar murders, Stanislav Ganerka appeared to be the prime suspect, but the police never searched his residence or his vehicle. Investigators interviewed him on 2 separate occasions, but Ganerka claimed he was innocent, and he never went to see a prostitute. And that was the end of him being a suspect for the police. For some unknown reason, the police had decided to place all of their resources into proving that the 2 young doctors were the culprits. Forensic pathologist Gerhard Vogt, who performed all 3 autopsies on Ganerka's victims, observed how the killer had anatomical knowledge. He also publicly stated how he was very confused, quite perplexed as to why the police hadn't considered him a viable suspect in Katrina da Costa's murder and dismemberment. Years later, further investigation would link Ganerka to the case, and although the prosecutor objected to a DNA test being done on Ganerka, who was now deceased, the district court ruled that his tissue samples could be released. However, the Svea Court of Appeals intervened. In a shocking determination, the court ruled against his DNA samples being tested because it would be incriminating against him. They claimed that they don't test the deceased out of respect for the dead, but there had been several other cases in which they had. So it left some wondering, why weren't they willing to test Ganerka's samples to confirm or deny his being the perpetrator? It's not as if the man was a stand-up, law-abiding citizen. He was a psychotic, convicted serial killer who most likely had been behind other unsolved murders. Former police inspector Ola Torgay and Alingsas believe that Tiet Harm and Thomas Algen were innocent of the crimes and that Ganerka was the true killer. Officer Torgay was so committed to proving the truth that he went so far as to try to obtain DNA from Ganerka's relatives on his own so he could compare the hairs on the towel. In addition to the general practitioner and the coroner and the serial killer, Stanislav Ganerka. Several other men have been suspects of involvement in Katrine DaCosta's death and dismemberment over the years. One of them was referred to as Janne, who was detained for 3 days in 1999. Police professor Leif Persson is among those who is convinced that Janne knows how Katrine DaCosta died. Janne had made allegations about knowing something about her death that the police never looked into. Police officer Persson believes that Janne knows how she was killed. He doesn't think he was behind the dismemberment, though, noting his mental fragility, but he thinks he may have had an accomplice in the process after murdering, possibly by accident, Katrine. This alleged assistant was also never investigated. It was confirmed by the police that Janne did know Katrine DaCosta. In fact, one of her earrings had been located at his residence. However, when his DNA was tested years later with the hair on the towel, just like the doctor's, it didn't match. Another possible suspect was a man referred to as Vincent. He was near the scene of the crime on the evening it was believed that Katrine was killed, and he had access to weapons. His name was also located within Katrine's address book, and he owned a brothel at the time of the events. The man known as Vincent also had experience with slaughtering animals and didn't have an alibi. Yet with all of this promising evidence connecting him to the crime and the victim, the investigators questioned him once and then later on had another brief discussion with him. No searches or forensic tests were ever performed on Vincent. A witness, a man named Bent, who claimed to be a good friend of Katrine's, later came forward when he saw that the police were reinvestigating her murder. He stated that he last saw Katrine that Friday evening on Gamla Brogatan in Stockholm. He said Katrine was accompanied by a middle-aged Swedish man with dark, medium-length hair. Bent described the man as being highly stressed and uncomfortable, and he appeared to be under the influence of drugs. The conversation between him and Katrine was short, and they went their separate ways. There is also the matter of Professor Jovan Rice, the senior forensics doctor who had been a mentor and professor to the coroner, Tiet Harm. The doctor appeared to have gone out of his way to implicate Tiet Harm in the murder and dismemberment of Katrine DaCosta, although Jovan Rice has always stood by his accusations and belief in the doctor's guilt. He also wrote in his book that if he hadn't made the connection between the doctor's and the child's story, and I quote, the coroner would have come back to forensic medicine, obtained a doctorate, and perhaps succeeded me as professor. Doesn't that really say all that needs to be said about this man's possible motivation for helping the police and the prosecution frame and persecute two innocent men, in particular, Tiet Harm? Both the coroner and the general practitioner, also known as Tiet Harm and Thomas Algen, still hold hope that one day they will receive justice for their wrongful convictions and the revocation of their medical licenses. The courts could still provide them with a formal apology and compensation and renew their licenses, but their trust in justice in Sweden has long since expired. Many elements and individuals within the justice and legal system in Sweden collaborated to unfairly target and punish them without any real evidence of their guilt. So many years have passed, yet no one seems willing to come forward and acknowledge the wrongs, the errors, the defamation and destruction of these men's lives. What I find very interesting is how there are many people, true crime bloggers in particular, that believe these men are guilty and discuss this case as if it were only a miscarriage of justice because they were acquitted. I have even come across claims that Teet Harm was a serial killer. Based on what evidence are these individuals and websites making such allegations? I understand and acknowledge that there were some bizarre circumstances, and Teet Harm in particular may not have been the most likable character, but that doesn't make him a murderer, and definitely does not mean he was a serial killer. Not only is it dangerous and unethical to print this kind of so-called journalism because it taints the facts of the case, but it also erases the importance of still needing to prove who murdered Katrine DaCosta and the countless other women who have been marginalized and dismissed by law enforcement, the legal system, and society at large, and continue to do so around the world today. Katrine's tragic story and horrific murder have been noted as being a source of inspiration to several authors, including the late fiction writer Stieg Larsson, the man who created the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo series, which centered around Sweden's criminal underbelly. It helped to bring to light the darkness of the drug trafficking and prostitution that was occurring in the red light district at the time. It likely inspired the Swedish Sex Act of 1999, which makes it illegal to purchase sex services, but does not make it illegal to provide or sell them, which helps to protect and empower sex workers. There are many within the medical community and legal scholars who not only continue to believe in the innocence of Teet Harm and Thomas Algen in the murder and dismemberment of Katrine DaCosta, but also don't agree with their medical licenses being revoked. Some have even compared these events to a witch trial. These men were painted as sadistic monsters based on a child's stories reported by a vengeful and paranoid mother. These young doctors were viewed as guilty from the start, and as a result, their reputations, careers, and ultimately their lives were destroyed by rumors, hearsay, and a misplaced quest for justice. 40 years later, in 2024, a documentary was released in Sweden detailing the horrific crime and the unfolding of what many now consider to be a wrongful conviction against the doctors. To many in recent years, these events are perceived as one of the greatest legal scandals in Sweden, a case of the ultimate miscarriage of justice for both the young doctors and especially for Katrine DaCosta and her family. The injustice doesn't just end with the doctors and the victim, but also for the small child, his daughter, who became the key witness in the state, due to the manipulations and accusations of unproven abuse that 4 different examinations found no evidence of. This daughter and father have been separated from one another for over 25 years, based on the unfounded reasons within the verdict. The child and her mother were legally provided with confidentiality, leading them to disappear from society, with the father never knowing where his daughter was. I choose to deal with facts when I conduct research and discuss a case, unless there is irrefutable forensic evidence of their involvement, their confessions, or even strong circumstantial evidence. I default to believing these men were innocent. The star witnesses were a paranoid, possibly mentally ill mother speaking for her toddler, and an aging forensics professor who viewed one of the defendants as a direct threat to his position. If there is a significant reason as to why others who talk about this case believe the defendants were guilty, then they should state it as such. Being interested in violent horror films, sadistic pornography, and paying for sex doesn't mean someone is necessarily violent or evil, much less a serial killer. If that were the case, we would be dealing with thousands upon thousands, if not millions of men killing women under similar circumstances. It's important that society not allow personality flaws and character traits to undermine the truth and derail justice. When an innocent person is convicted of a crime, it is a matter of double injustice. Being convicted of a serious offense with little to no sufficient evidence is a betrayal of legal requirements and integrity. The convicted is now a victim of the inefficient, even corrupt system, while the real perpetrator remains free, and the victim of the crime and their loved ones still await true justice. Katrine DaCosta's mother and sister have expressed disappointment and anger towards how law enforcement has continually dismissed them. Throughout the investigations over the years, they never received any useful, significant information. Katrine DaCosta wasn't just a marginalized woman, a drug-addicted homeless prostitute who has been forgotten about. Katrine was a mother of 2 children whom she loved. She was a daughter and a sister who was and still is dearly missed by them. When people who knew Katrine DaCosta talked about her, they described her as being shy, kind, gentle, and vulnerable. She was struggling still with her addiction, but at the time of her death, she had been making strides toward getting herself off of drugs so she could regain custody of her children. She was loved and appreciated by many people who knew her, but her addiction, her demons, held far too much power over her life. In the end, the darkness consumed her, and someone, or multiple persons, took advantage of her vulnerable state in life and preyed upon her to fulfill their perverse, twisted desires. Thank you so much for listening to the fascinating legal case of the coroner and the general practitioner and the dismemberment trials of Sweden. If you have any questions, comments, ideas for future episodes, I would love to hear from you. Please reach out. You can find my contact information in the episode description. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.